took office, he said that he was going to reset relations with Russia, that he was going to talk with Iran, that he was going to make peace with countries around the world, that it was going to be a break from what Bush had done. It was going to reset things. It was going to be moving toward peace and away from Bush's policies of interventionism. And we saw how that worked out under the Obama administration with Libya, with Syria, with all kinds of foreign interventions. And Trump ran for president, won on a platform very similar, that he was going to reset relations, he was going to get along with countries around the world, he was going to stop meddling in foreign countries and put America's needs first. And look where we are. It seems that the powers that be that seem to push these interventions are more powerful than our elected leaders. And that should be terrifying to anyone who believes in the notion of democracy.
Yeah, and what I see, what's interesting with Trump is it appears to me, Donald Trump tried to kind of act a little dovish, but what it appears to me is Donald Trump wants to do everything. It's fine with doing everything up until firing the missile that starts the war. He didn't mind firing missiles at Syria. He doesn't mind, starving people, medieval sieges against countries so they die with no medicine and food. But firing a missile that's going to actually start a war, he's not interested in that. And so I think to some extent it seemed to me like Donald Trump wasn't a hard win, wasn't a very difficult win for them because they could get most of what they wanted. All of the rest of that stuff they're happy with. They're just mad because he won't start a war with Iran, it appears to me. Caleb.
Sure. There are days where I wake up in the morning and I say, thank goodness for Donald Trump's ego. I think Donald Trump has seen that clip of Lyndon Johnson saying, I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term. He's seen that clip, and he knows that Lyndon Johnson went down in history as the guy who did Gulf of Tonkin and started, the Vietnam War and couldn't get out of it. I think he knows that George W. Bush, no matter what goes on, is always going to be remembered as the guy when it comes to Iraq. And for whatever reason, Donald Trump, he seems to just on a personal level have a desire to not go down in history as the guy who started a war. And when we hear about that strike on Iran that was 10 minutes away and he called it off, again, thank goodness for his ego. It may be simply that. It may not be a commitment to non-interventionism. It may simply be his ego and his drive to not be remembered as the guy. And that may be what's preserving world peace in the world. It may be that simple.
Well, here's what I would say. They're doing everything else but. When I look at what's happening, when we talk about the foreign policy consensus, you must talk about the monster behind, the behind the curtain, who's pulling the strings. And when you look at everything that they're doing, using the way I put it is they're using monetary policy as the sword of the empire. We're doing medieval sanctions. So to me, when I look at it, okay, they didn't get their war on Iran, but they're getting the ability to use everything that the United States has as a weapon. Your economic policy should be used and enacted in the best interest of your economy, of strengthening your economy. But our economic policy is now about foreign policy. It's like they're saying well, okay, President Trump won't attack. So in lieu of that, in lieu of bombs, we'll have to use whatever else we have, which I predict is going to, really hurt us in the long run. But so in a way, when I look at it, these people still have their hands on the steering wheel. It's just they're giving Donald Trump a limited number of options that he can take. The president gets, people say they have a lot of power. Not really, because they may have power, but they have a very limited number of options that they can use. And they're all about bullying the rest of the world. Caleb.
Well, it's worse than that. We have an international financial system that essentially depends on keeping the world poor. I mean, that's essentially what's going on here is when development takes place, when countries start pulling themselves up out of poverty, start producing their own products, start exporting their own oil, start manufacturing their own steel, start developing their own industries, that's a threat to the international financial system. And that's the situation that we're in, and it's really shocking. But if you look at it, I mean, China, back in the 1940s, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. No steel industry, no manufacturing. Now China is producing half the steel in the entire world. They've raised 700 million people out of poverty. and now they're a target for Trump's tariffs, and they're a target for attack. If you look at Russia during the 1990s, when Russia's economy was devastated, when people were fleeing the country and the farming system had shut down and the factories closed their doors with the Yeltsin administration, that was the height. That was when the Clintons and the White House loved Russia. The USA was getting along with Russia just fine when their economy was wrecked. But when Russia got itself together and started selling oil and gas on the international markets and competing once again, all of a sudden we see tension. And if you look at all these countries, nobody talks about Libya. Remember, we were supposed to go into Libya. Obama told us that we had to rescue those poor people in Libya, right? That evil Gaddafi was killing them, and we were going to save them and bring them freedom. Look at Libya since 2011, since the military intervention. Nobody in their right mind can look at Libya and say that Libya is better off today than it was under Gaddafi. They used to have the highest life expectancy on the African continent. Now that country is divided, wars, killing, people are getting on rafts, trying to flee the country in the Mediterranean and drowning, and it's a mess. I mean, every headline you see out of Libya, the country has just been destroyed. This was a prosperous, oil-producing African country that has been reduced to rubble and chaos, right? It's about keeping the world poor so that Western banking institutions based in Wall Street and London can maintain a monopoly. It's about controlling the trade routes. It's imperialism, and that seems to be what is driving this foreign intervention. And around the world, we see countries centered around Russia and China in alliance with them, trying to raise themselves out of poverty and then being targeted for attack. It is about maintaining an international financial system.
Well, we have Patrick Henningsen in studio with us. Patrick, I noticed this. You've done a lot of reporting on Syria. I noticed this a few years ago when people were talking about Syria. The question I used to ask was, okay, you don't like Assad. What comes after? Explain to me who's the guy? Because usually they'll be like, well, we don't want Assad. We want Billy, or Jimmy or whoever, right? And I noticed they had no answer. And what I realized was it goes to what Caleb's saying, which is they just wanted a failed state. I realized that the people who were opposed to Assad, the only thing, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, because you know more than I do, Patrick, it seemed to me that just what they wanted was ruin. And Libya is the perfect example of that. It's not like they wanted regime change exactly. They just wanted, if they could get it, great. If they could get a puppet government, great. But if it's chaos, that's fine, because people can do it. Did you notice the same thing?
Yeah, look, the two are very similar. In Libya, they created a government, like a Vichy government, the National Transitional Council.
Right.
And they put their people on there. They put an executive in charge, Libyan, very Western friendly. And in Syria, they did the same thing. The Syrian National Council. So they're running around five-star hotels in Paris, Istanbul, showing up in London, showing up in Washington, some of them. And so the Samantha Powers of the world, the sort of liberal interventionists, they like that model, basically. And so, but this is going to fail miserably in Syria. And people say, why do the Syrians support the Assad family? Why do they support Bashar al-Assad? Why can't they change their government every 4 years like us in the West? Be more democratic. And one of the reasons is in those countries, in these places in the world, the people are used to, there's a tradition of very strong leadership. They do have problems, sectarian issues. They have geopolitical problems. They got problems with their neighbors. Israel and Syria have effectively been at war for the better part of 50 years. And so that's an overriding issue. It requires strong leadership. It requires a recognizable, proven brand that can rule the country, that can unite the country. And in the case of Syria, that's Bashar al-Assad. That's the Assad family. It's a trusted, known brand. But in the West, wants to get rid of this model. They want instability, and they're not sure exactly how they would replace a leader like that. The only option, Lee, like you said, is a failed state. And that seems to be a preferred option than sort of the stability that you're beginning to see right now in Syria as the civil war's tapering down.
Yeah, Caleb, now let me ask this, too. I mean, while this is going on, and again, I'm one of those people who, I got to say, some of the stuff against China to me seems valid in the sense that there was some unfair economic advantage stuff going on with China, and I think that does need to be addressed. in some way. You brought up the steel industry, for instance. I've been in places like Steubenville, Ohio, for instance, and they told me up there a few years ago when I was working on a story that the steel industry up in places like Ohio, West Virginia, absolutely devastated. There's no steel industry there anymore, and that's really had an effect. And I understand that. But I do think that these tariffs have been pushed by people into a form of, like you say, promoting empire. So do you find any middle ground here, Caleb, about genuine economic interest and where American president might be concerned about China?
Well, in terms of steel manufacturing, the biggest jobs killer in the steel industry has been technology. You can have a steel mill now that has exponentially fewer workers involved in the process. In terms of how steel is manufactured, you need fewer workers to do it. And I think that's a bigger issue than simply China producing steel. But if you look at the trade tariffs against China, one of the main targets has been this program, Made in China 2025, which is essentially nothing more than the Chinese government investing in technology. The Chinese government has poured billions of dollars into, science, technology, R&D, research and development, trying to make breakthroughs in computers and smartphone technology and artificial intelligence and data technology and trying to just become a cutting edge in the high-tech world. And they have repeatedly, many times, tried to make Made in China 2025 a joint operation. They have reached out to American universities, American technology corporations, and tried to make this a joint effort in which both the United States and China would cooperate. And rather than working with China in their efforts to advance technology, we now see an effort from the United States not only to not cooperate with them, but to crush the program. It's really, really a mistake in my view. And that essentially another thing that needs to be understood is that China is vulnerable. China is not an oil-producing country. They depend on oil imports from overseas. That's actually why they're so concerned about the South China Sea, because that's where most of their oil comes in, on oil tankers via the South China Sea. And they depend on oil being imported from the United States, from Saudi Arabia, from other countries, from Iran, and they realize that is a weakness that their economy has. They are producing a lot. They have huge amounts of manufacturing. But they need oil, and that has driven China to become the world's center of electric cars. No one comes close to China when it comes to electric cars. They are leading the world in terms of new energy vehicles. They are producing more solar panels than any other country in the world. They're trying to get out of fossil fuels because they realize it is a place that they are vulnerable and dependent. And if you look at, when I reference this international financial system, it's all about oil. All the major oil companies, the big four super major oil companies, they're tied in with banks. Chase Bank is ExxonMobil, right? HSBC Bank is British Petroleum. If you look at it, this international banking system that we have, this financial system, is closely tied in with the big four super major oil companies. And the fact that essentially the oil markets are cornered by Wall Street in London. And if we were to move as a society, as a civilization, away from fossil fuels, that would be the end of the hegemony of Western bankers. And that if you listen to it, ExxonMobil, which is Standard Oil, it's the descendant of Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller. They talk about global warming, but they talk about it in a very pessimistic way. If you listen to a lot of the voices, the answer to global warming is to stop historical progress, right? It's just, there's too many people in the world, there's overpopulation, people use too much technology, they have too much comfortable lives, people are just too comfortable, they use too many resources, they need to be poorer. But if you listen to the way China talks about global warming and climate change, they say the answer to climate change is technology. It's new science, it's cutting-edge breakthroughs, it's advancing. And they're talking about addressing the same issue of climate change. They're talking about the same issue of fossil fuels. But one side seems to talk about climate change as if the answer is pessimism. The answer is to look backward. But another side is saying, let's talk about climate change and let's overcome it by getting beyond fossil fuels and making cutting-edge breakthroughs in technology. Two different approaches.
Well, let me ask you this. What do you think about all of the selling of gold? It appears to me that, I noticed Russia doing it a few years ago, basically dumping dollars and selling gold. I see China do it. Poland, there's some other countries start to do it. It appears to me that there is the formation, and again, I think it's because of the U.S. Pushing so hard on other countries economically. There's the formation of an alternate adversarial bloc, an Eastern adversarial economic bloc, and it's getting more and more powerful, and the lines are getting better, stronger and more delineated. What do you think about, kind of what I'm getting at here?
Well, the petrodollar is already on its way out, and the dollar, and really the Bretton Woods financial system, right, is in decline, and that's widely understood. And with the rise of the Eurasian Economic Union, with the rise of the One Belt, One Road initiative from China, most specifically the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is just key. All of this is pointing toward, a Eurasian future for the planet, right? And a bipolar world, right? The bipolar world is fading, and a bipolar world in which there are alternative, multipolar world, I should say, in which there are alternative centers on the economic global sphere. That is the reality that's emerging, and I think there are many different signs that you can point toward for that.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time here, Caleb. Where can people go online to find your stuff, to find more about what you're doing and your work?
Oh, well, you can just go to my website, CalebMaupin.com. That's CalebMaupin.com.
Wonderful. Caleb Maupin. He is a journalist and political analyst, and we've been talking about the bipartisan foreign policy consensus in Washington, D.C. Thanks a lot, Caleb. We got another hour. We've got Nico House coming up on at 9:20, and we're going to talk about Tulsi Gabbard's impact on the 2020 race. Mike Gravel has qualified for the next debate, and I think that's interesting. That's going to be fun because here's a guy who's like around 90 years old. He's like got nothing to lose. He can go there and say anything he wants.
He's a legend.
Yeah, I think it's going to be beautiful. I can't wait for that. We'll be back one more hour with Garland Nixon, Lee Stranahan, and, of course, the founder and editor at 21stCenturyWire.com, the one and only Patrick Henningsen. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.